Sarah Martinez adjusted her reading glasses as she sorted through returned books at the small-town library in Cedar Falls, Montana. At 32, she had the kind of quiet demeanor that made people think she had spent her entire life surrounded by books. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore comfortable sweaters that made her blend into the background of any room. What the townspeople didn't know was that Sarah had only been living in Cedar Falls for 3 years. Before that, she had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of the few women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served in operations across 3 continents, saved countless lives, and earned decorations that now sat locked away in a safety deposit box 2 towns over. Sarah had come to Cedar Falls seeking the peace that had eluded her during her military service. The nightmares had been getting worse, and her commanding officer had strongly suggested she take extended leave. What was supposed to be a temporary break had turned into a new life when she fell in love with the town's simplicity. She rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, spent her days managing the library's modest collection, and her evenings reading by the fireplace with her rescue dog, Atlas. The German Shepherd had been her constant companion since she found him injured on a hiking trail 2 years ago. Like Sarah, Atlas seemed to appreciate the quiet life they had built together. The library was Sarah's sanctuary. She knew every book on every shelf, helped kids with their homework, and organized reading clubs for seniors. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had hired her, often commented on how Sarah seemed to have an instinct for helping people find exactly what they needed, whether it was a cookbook for a new recipe or a mystery novel to pass a rainy afternoon. But even in this peaceful setting, Sarah remained vigilant. Old habits die hard, and her training had taught her to always be aware of her surroundings. She noticed things others missed, the way the mailman favored his left leg, suggesting an old injury, or how the teenage Thompson boy had started wearing long sleeves even in summer, possibly hiding something at home. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Sarah was cataloging new arrivals when she heard the rumble of motorcycles outside. Through the large front window, she watched as 6 men on Harley-Davidsons pulled into the small parking lot. They wore leather jackets with patches that Sarah recognized from her military intelligence briefings. The Iron Wolves, a motorcycle club with connections to drug trafficking and weapons smuggling. The men dismounted their bikes with the swagger of people accustomed to intimidating others. Their leader, a man with a gray beard and arms covered in tattoos, pointed toward the library and said something that made the others laugh. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of adrenaline that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. She moved away from the window and continued her work, but every sense was now heightened. The library had 3 exits: the main door, a back door that led to the parking area behind the building, and a window in the children's section that could be opened in an emergency. Sarah mentally cataloged these options while maintaining the appearance of someone absorbed in her mundane task. The bell above the front door chimed as the men entered. They moved through the space like they owned it, their heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floors. The leader approached the circulation desk where Sarah stood, his presence filling the small area with tension. "We're looking for someone," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of a lifetime smoker. "Tommy Reeves. Heard he might be hiding out in this little town." Sarah looked up from her computer screen with the practiced expression of mild confusion she had perfected. "I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name. Are you sure you have the right town?" The man leaned closer, his breath smelling of coffee and cigarettes. "See, that's funny because we got it on good authority that Tommy's been using your library's computers. Seems he's been trying to contact some people he shouldn't be talking to." "I'm afraid I can't discuss patron information," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Library policy." One of the other men laughed, a sound without humor. "Library policy? You hear that, boys? This little librarian's got policies." Sarah kept her hands relaxed at her sides, fighting every instinct that told her these men were dangerous. In her peripheral vision, she noticed Mrs. Patterson, a regular patron, quickly gathering her things from a reading table near the mystery section. The elderly woman had clearly sensed the change in atmosphere. "Maybe you didn't hear us right," the leader continued, placing both hands flat on the counter and leaning forward. "We're not asking for a library card. We want to know about Tommy Reeves, and we want to know now." "And maybe you didn't hear me," Sarah responded, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I can't help you with that information." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. The 6 men spread out slightly, a movement Sarah recognized as a basic intimidation tactic. They were trying to make her feel surrounded and helpless. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had faced down armed insurgents in Afghanistan and had never backed down from a fight in her life. "You know what I think?" the leader said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I think you're protecting this Tommy character. I think maybe you're more involved than you're letting on." Before Sarah could respond, Atlas appeared from behind the reference section where he had been napping. The German Shepherd had clearly sensed the tension and positioned himself between Sarah and the men, his ears alert and his body tense. "Well, would you look at that?" one of the bikers said. The little librarian's got herself a guard dog. Sarah felt the situation escalating and knew she needed to defuse it quickly. "Look, I understand you're looking for someone, but I really can't help you. This is a public library. If you're not here to use our services, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The leader straightened up, his face darkening. "You're going to ask us to leave? You? And what army, sweetheart?" It was then that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached for the phone on the circulation desk, intending to call the local police. It wasn't that she couldn't handle these men. Her training had prepared her for far worse situations. But she had built a life in Cedar Falls based on being invisible, on letting other people handle the problems while she faded into the background. The leader's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist before she could pick up the phone. His grip was firm, but not yet painful, a warning rather than an attack. "I don't think you want to do that," he said softly. Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. For a moment, she let him see something flicker in her eyes, a glimpse of the person she used to be. The change was subtle, but unmistakable, like a predator dropping its camouflage. "Let go of my wrist," she said quietly. Something in her tone must have surprised him because his grip loosened slightly. But he didn't release her. "Not until we get some answers about Tommy Reeves." Sarah glanced around the library, noting that Mrs. Patterson had successfully made it to the front door and was probably calling for help. The other patrons had also cleared out, leaving just Sarah, Atlas, and the 6 bikers in the building. "I told you," she said, her voice still calm, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I don't know anyone by that name." The leader's grip tightened again, and Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. She had spent 3 years building a peaceful life, and these men were threatening to destroy it with their presence. "Maybe we need to search this place ourselves," suggested one of the other bikers. "Check those computers, see what we can find." "You're not searching anything," Sarah said firmly. "This is a public library, not your personal investigation center." The leader leaned closer again, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Listen, lady, I don't think you understand how serious this situation is. Tommy Reeves stole something that belongs to us, and we're going to find him whether you help us or not." Sarah felt Atlas shift beside her, the dog's hackles rising as he sensed her growing tension. She took a slow breath, trying to maintain the facade she had built so carefully. But these men were pushing her toward a line she had hoped never to cross again. "I understand you have a problem," she said carefully. "But threatening me isn't going to solve it." "Who said anything about threats?" The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're just having a conversation between friends." The other men chuckled at this, and Sarah realized that they were enjoying the intimidation. They saw her as an easy target, a small-town librarian who could be bullied into compliance. They had no idea how wrong they were. The leader's grip on Sarah's wrist was becoming painful now, and she could see the satisfied smirk on his face as he applied more pressure. In her peripheral vision, she noticed 2 of his companions moving toward the computer stations while the others positioned themselves to block the exits. "You know what I think happened here?" The leader continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "I think little Tommy came in here, used these computers to send some messages he shouldn't have sent, and Maybe got friendly with the helpful librarian. Maybe you even helped him compose those messages. Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. You're mistaken. Am I? He twisted her wrist slightly, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Because we traced the IP address of those messages right back to this library, and the timestamp shows someone was here after closing hours. Someone with access. One of the men at the computer stations called out, "Bobby, come look at this." The browser history's been wiped, but I can still see some cache files. The leader, Bobby, grinned wider. See? We're getting somewhere now. He leaned closer to Sarah, his breath hot on her face. Why don't you save us all some time and just tell us where Tommy is? I told you, Sarah said, her voice still controlled but with steel underneath. I don't know anyone named Tommy Reeves. Bobby's expression darkened. You know what? I'm getting tired of this little game. He nodded to one of his men. Jake, go check the back rooms. Maybe Tommy's hiding back there right now. Sarah watched as Jake headed toward the staff area behind the circulation desk. That was where she kept her personal belongings, including the locked drawer that contained items from her military service, things she had hoped never to need again. You can't search private areas without a warrant, she said, trying one last time to resolve this peacefully. Bobby laughed outright. A warrant? Lady, do you see any cops around here? He gestured to his companions. We don't need warrants. We just need answers. Atlas growled low in his throat, sensing the escalating danger. Sarah placed her free hand on the dog's head, a gesture that appeared calming but was actually a signal she had taught him during their training sessions. Atlas's muscles tensed as he prepared for action. From the back room, they heard Jake's voice. Bobby, you need to see this. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew exactly what Jake had found. In her haste to leave that morning, she hadn't locked the staff room door properly, and Jake had discovered the framed photograph she kept on her desk, a picture of her SEAL team after a successful mission in Syria. Well, Bobby said, noticing the change in Sarah's expression. Looks like our little librarian's been keeping secrets. Jake emerged from the back room, carrying the photograph. Bobby, you're not going to believe this. Take a look at what I found in her desk. Bobby finally released Sarah's wrist to take the frame. His eyes widened as he studied the image of 8 heavily armed soldiers standing in desert camouflage, Sarah clearly visible among them. Navy SEALs, he read from the caption at the bottom. Operation Desert Storm, Team 7. He looked back at Sarah, his expression a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. Well, I'll be damned. Our little librarian's got some teeth after all. Sarah remained silent, but her entire posture had shifted subtly. The change was almost imperceptible, but to anyone with military training, it would have been obvious. She was no longer trying to look small and harmless. This changes things, Bobby continued, setting the frame on the counter. You're not just some small-town librarian helping out a friend. You're military. That means you know the value of intelligence, and you understand what happens to people who get in the way of business operations. It doesn't change anything, Sarah replied, her voice steadier now. I still don't know anyone named Tommy Reeves, and I still need you to leave my library. Bobby studied her with new interest. Your library? That's funny. See, now that I know what you really are, I'm wondering if maybe you and Tommy have more of a professional relationship than a personal one. Maybe he hired himself some protection. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the weight of her old life pressing against the boundaries of her new one. Every instinct honed by years of combat training was telling her to assess threats, plan escape routes, and prepare for action. Jake, Marcus, Bobby called to 2 of his men. Go outside and keep watch. Make sure our new friend here doesn't have any backup coming. To the others, he said, spread out. Check every corner of this place. Sarah watched as the men moved through her sanctuary like invaders, appending carefully arranged displays and pulling books from shelves. They were sending a message, cooperation or destruction. One of the bikers, a younger man with nervous energy, approached the children's section and began methodically destroying the reading corner Sarah had spent months creating. He tipped over the small chairs, and scattered picture books across the floor. "Stop," Sarah said sharply. The man looked over at Bobby, who nodded. "Keep going, Tommy. Let's see how much damage we need to do before our librarian gets talkative." Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had watched cities burn and good people die during her military service. She had come to Cedar Falls specifically to escape violence and create something positive. Watching these men destroy the space that represented everything she was trying to build felt like watching them tear apart her soul. "I said stop," she repeated, her voice carrying a command authority that made the young biker freeze mid-motion. Bobby noticed the change immediately. "Now, there's the voice I was expecting to hear. That's not a librarian talking. That's a soldier." Sarah realized she had crossed a line. The careful facade she had maintained for 3 years was crumbling, and there was no going back. But as she watched Tommy resume his destruction of the children's area, she found she didn't care anymore. "You want to know about Tommy Reeves?" she said quietly. "Fine. He was here." Bobby's eyes lit up with triumph. "Now we're getting somewhere." "When? Where did he go?" "He came in 3 weeks ago," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the crisp precision of a military briefing. "Used the computers for about an hour. Paid in cash, gave a fake name on the sign-in sheet. Left no trace except what you found in the cache files." "What was he doing on the computers?" "I don't monitor patron activity," Sarah replied. "But he seemed nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder, jumped every time someone walked by." Bobby stepped closer again. "Did he say anything? Give any indication where he was going?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "He asked about bus schedules. Wanted to know the routes heading south." "Which route specifically?" "I don't remember," Sarah lied smoothly. "There are several options." Bobby's expression hardened. "I think you remember more than you're letting on." In the background, Tommy had moved on to the reference section and was pulling books off shelves with increasing aggression. Sarah watched a leather-bound atlas, one of the library's oldest and most valuable books, hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Your friend there seems to be enjoying himself," Sarah observed. "Tommy gets enthusiastic," Bobby replied. "But he'll stop when you start being more helpful." Sarah looked around the library, taking in the chaos these men had created in just a few minutes. Books scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, her carefully maintained order destroyed. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, probably at the police station right now, trying to explain what she had witnessed. She thought about the children who came to Storytime every Wednesday, and how they would feel seeing their favorite corner demolished. Most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to herself 3 years ago, that she would never again be the person who solved problems with violence. But as she watched Tommy grab another book and prepare to throw it, Sarah realized that sometimes the only way to protect the things you love is to become the person you used to be. "You know what?" she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I think this conversation is over." Bobby's eyes narrowed. "It's over when I say it's over, sweetheart." Sarah smiled then, but it wasn't the mild expression the townspeople of Cedar Falls were accustomed to seeing. It was the smile of a predator that had just decided to stop hiding. "No," she said softly, "it really isn't." The change in Sarah was instantaneous and complete. Years of careful conditioning melted away as she stepped fully back into the skin of the warrior she had once been. Bobby sensed the shift immediately, his cockiness faltering as he found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Move it, you dog," Bobby snarled at Atlas, who was still positioned protectively beside Sarah. It was a phrase that would echo through the news reports and police interviews in the days to come. The last word spoken by a man who had no idea he was about to make the worst mistake of his life. Sarah's response was swift and decisive. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Bobby's wrist with her left hand while her right hand shot up to strike his elbow joint. The leverage and angle were perfect, and Bobby's arm bent backward with a sickening crack that echoed through the library like a gunshot. Bobby's scream of pain and surprise filled the space, but Sarah was already moving. Years of muscle memory took over as she pivoted, using Bobby's momentum and her grip on his broken arm to throw him over the circulation desk. He landed hard among the scattered books behind the counter, his head striking the corner of a filing cabinet on the way down. The other 3 men in the library reacted with the delayed shock of people who had never expected real violence. They had been playing at intimidation, using the threat of force rather than force itself. Sarah had just shown them the difference. "Bobby!" Tommy shouted, dropping the book he had been holding and reaching inside his leather jacket. Sarah was already airborne. She vaulted over the circulation desk in a move that would have impressed her old drill instructors, landing beside Bobby's motionless form and immediately rolling to avoid Tommy's line of sight. Her hand found the heavy metal bookend she kept on the lower shelf, a bronze horse that Mrs. Henderson had given her when she started working at the library. Tommy's gun cleared his jacket just as Sarah came up from a roll and hurled the bookend with the accuracy of someone who had thrown grenades under enemy fire. The bronze horse caught Tommy in the center of his forehead, and he dropped like a stone, his unfired weapon clattering across the hardwood floor. The remaining 2 men, one near the mystery section and another by the front windows, stared in shock as their companions fell within seconds of each other. Sarah used their hesitation to her advantage, rolling behind the solid oak reference desk and quickly assessing her situation. Atlas, responding to the chaos and his mistress's obvious distress, launched himself at the man by the windows. The German Shepherd had been trained not just as a companion, but as a working dog, and his 90 pounds of muscle and teeth took the biker down before the man could reach for his own weapon. That left one opponent still standing, a lean man with prison tattoos covering his arms who had positioned himself near the emergency exit. Sarah could see him calculating whether to run or fight, his hand hovering near the bulge in his jacket that indicated another concealed weapon. "I wouldn't," Sarah called out from behind the reference desk, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone in complete control of the situation. "You've got maybe 3 seconds before the police arrive, and your friend's going to need medical attention." The man's eyes darted between Sarah's position, the emergency exit, and his fallen comrades. Bobby was unconscious and bleeding from his head wound. Tommy wasn't moving at all. The 3rd man was on the ground with Atlas standing over him, the dog's teeth mere inches from his throat. "Call off the dog," the standing man said, his voice shaking slightly. "Atlas, hold," Sarah commanded, and the German Shepherd immediately froze in position, maintaining his threatening stance but not attacking further. Sarah rose slowly from behind the desk, her movements controlled and precise. In her hand, she held a letter opener. Not much of a weapon, but in the right hands, it could be lethal. The man with the tattoos noticed her grip on the blade and realized she knew exactly how to use it. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to brief her SEAL team before dangerous missions. "You're going to tell your friend on the ground to stay very still. Then you're going to put your hands where I can see them and wait for the authorities to arrive." "You don't understand who you're messing with," the man replied, but his earlier confidence was gone. "We're not the only ones looking for Tommy Reeves. When word gets out about what happened here—" "Let me worry about that," Sarah interrupted. "Right now, your concern should be keeping yourself and your friends alive until help arrives." Through the library's front windows, she could see the flashing lights of Cedar Falls' 2 police cruisers approaching fast. Mrs. Patterson had indeed called for help, and the entire police force was responding to what they probably thought was a simple disturbance call. Sarah felt a moment of regret for what was about to unfold. Chief Morrison and his officers were good people, but they were small-town cops who dealt mainly with drunk driving and domestic disputes. They weren't prepared for the kind of violence that came with organized crime. The man with the tattoos seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Those local boys aren't going to be able to protect you," he said. "The Iron Wolves don't forget, and we don't forgive." "The Iron Wolves," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Regional chapter out of Billings, I'm guessing. Controlled territory from here to the North Dakota border. Primary income sources include drug running, weapons trafficking, and protection rackets." The man's eyes widened. Sarah's knowledge wasn't the kind of information a small-town librarian would have. "You've been monitoring us," he accused. "I don't monitor anyone anymore," Sarah replied. But I remember briefings from when that kind of thing was my job. The police cruisers pulled into the parking lot with a screech of tires and a wail of sirens. Sarah could see Chief Morrison and Deputy Walsh getting out of their vehicles, hands already moving toward their service weapons as they took in the motorcycles parked outside. "Atlas, come," Sarah commanded, and the German shepherd immediately moved away from the man on the ground and returned to her side. The man who had been pinned slowly sat up, his face pale and his breathing ragged. Blood was streaming from bite marks on his arm where Atlas had grabbed him, but the wounds didn't look life-threatening. "Smart dog," the standing man observed. "Went for the arm instead of the throat." "He's trained to disable, not kill," Sarah replied. "Unless I tell him otherwise." The front door of the library burst open as Chief Morrison and Deputy Walsh entered with their weapons drawn. They stopped short as they took in the scene. Books and furniture scattered everywhere. One man unconscious behind the circulation desk, another lying motionless near the children's section, a third sitting on the floor clutching a bleeding arm, and Sarah standing calmly in the center of it all with a letter opener in her hand. "What in the hell happened here?" Chief Morrison demanded. "These men forced their way into the library and became violent when I refused to provide information about a patron," Sarah replied, setting the letter opener down on the reference desk. "I defended myself." Deputy Walsh moved cautiously toward Tommy, checking for a pulse while keeping one eye on the other bikers. "This one's alive, but unconscious. Looks like he took a hell of a hit to the head." Chief Morrison approached Bobby behind the circulation desk, his expression growing more concerned as he saw the awkward angle of the man's arm and the blood pooling beneath his head. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I need you to explain exactly what happened here." Sarah looked at the chief, a man she had come to respect during her 3 years in Cedar Falls. He was honest, competent within the scope of his experience, and genuinely cared about protecting his community. But he was about to be thrust into a situation far beyond anything his small-town training had prepared him for. "They were looking for someone named Tommy Reeves," she began, choosing her words carefully. "They claimed this person had used the library computers to send messages they considered threatening to their organization." "Their organization?" Deputy Walsh asked. The standing biker, the only one still conscious and coherent, spoke up. "The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. And this isn't over." Chief Morrison's face darkened as he recognized the name. Even in rural Montana, law enforcement officers knew about the Iron Wolves and their reputation for violence. "Sarah," the chief said quietly, "I need you to step away from the desk and keep your hands visible." Sarah complied without question, understanding that the chief was following protocol in a situation involving multiple injured suspects. She couldn't fault him for treating her as a potential threat until he understood what had really happened. "Chief," she said calmly, "there are 2 more outside maintaining watch. They're probably armed and wondering why their friends haven't come out yet." As if summoned by her words, they heard shouting from the parking lot, followed by the sound of motorcycle engines starting. Through the window, they could see 2 bikers mounting their Harleys and preparing to flee. "Walsh, get on the radio," Chief Morrison ordered. "Alert the state police and tell them we need backup. We've got members of a known criminal organization involved in an assault, and at least 2 are attempting to flee the scene." Deputy Walsh spoke rapidly into his radio, while Chief Morrison continued to survey the destruction inside the library. His eyes kept returning to Sarah, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered librarian he knew with the woman who had somehow defeated 3 armed men in hand-to-hand combat. "Sarah," he said finally, "I think we need to have a long conversation about exactly who you are." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I think you're probably right, Chief." Outside, the roar of departing motorcycles faded into the distance. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The Iron Wolves would regroup, and they would come back with more men and a better understanding of what they were facing. Her quiet life in Cedar Falls was over, but as she looked at the chaos around her, Sarah realized she felt more like herself than she had in years. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in Chief Morrison's office at the Cedar Falls police station, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The small building buzzed with more activity than it had seen in years. FBI agents had arrived from Billings. State police investigators were processing the library as a crime scene, and emergency medical technicians had transported the 3 injured bikers to the county hospital under armed guard. Sarah had spent the first hour giving her statement to Detective Ray Castellanos, a veteran investigator who had driven up from the state capitol. His questions had been thorough, but respectful, and Sarah could tell he was trying to piece together how a small-town librarian had managed to take down 3 armed criminals without sustaining a scratch. Mrs. Martinez, Detective Castellanos said, reviewing his notes, "Your military service explains the combat skills, but I'm still having trouble understanding how you identified the Iron Wolves so quickly. That kind of intelligence usually requires ongoing law enforcement connections." Sarah had been dreading this line of questioning. "I try to stay informed about potential threats to the community. When you live alone outside of town, you learn to pay attention to criminal activity in the region." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. During her final year with the SEALs, Sarah had been assigned to a joint task force monitoring domestic terrorist organizations, including motorcycle clubs with suspected ties to weapons smuggling. She knew more about the Iron Wolf structure and operations than most federal agents, but revealing that information would open doors she had spent 3 years trying to keep closed. Chief Morrison entered the office carrying a folder thick with documents. "The FBI background check came back," he said, settling into his chair across from Sarah. "Most of it's classified, but there's enough here to explain a lot." Sarah remained silent, waiting for the inevitable questions about her real identity and her reasons for being in Cedar Falls. 8 years active duty, multiple commendations for valor, served in 3 combat theaters, Morrison read from the file. Specialist in counterterrorism and hostage rescue. Medical discharge following a classified incident in Afghanistan. The chief looked up at Sarah. "The report doesn't give details about why you left the service, but it does mention PTSD and recommended extended psychological evaluation." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The classified incident had been an operation gone wrong, resulting in civilian casualties that still haunted her dreams. It was the reason she had sought out the quiet isolation of Cedar Falls, hoping to find peace in a place where the only conflicts involved overdue books and occasional disputes about library hours. "I came here to get away from that life," she said quietly. "I wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble found you anyway," Detective Castellanos observed. "The question now is what we do about it." Through the office window, Sarah could see FBI agents setting up a command post in the station's main room. Their presence meant the situation had escalated far beyond a simple assault case. The Iron Wolves were now a federal matter, and Sarah was about to become a key witness in a much larger investigation. "The man you identified as Bobby is actually Robert Bobby Hutchins, president of the Iron Wolves Montana chapter," Castellanos continued. "He's got outstanding warrants in 3 states and is suspected of ordering at least 2 contract killings. The fact that he came here personally tells us this Tommy Reeves situation is extremely important to their organization." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation of what she had already suspected. "What we still don't understand," Chief Morrison said, leaning forward in his chair, "is why you claim not to know anything about Tommy Reeves. Our computer forensics team found clear evidence that someone used the library's systems to access encrypted email accounts and transfer cryptocurrency. The timestamps match the dates when you were working alone after hours." Sarah had been expecting this revelation. Her decision to help Tommy Reeves had been made in a moment of recognition. She had seen something in his eyes that reminded her of her own desperate need to escape from a violent past. But that act of compassion had now drawn her back into the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. "Tommy Reeves is a federal witness," she said finally. "He came to me because he knew about my military background and thought I could help him stay hidden until his testimony." The 2 men exchanged glances. "How did he know about your background?" Detective Castellanos asked. "His handler is someone I served with in Afghanistan. When Tommy needed a safe place to lay low, my former teammate reached out through old military channels." It was another partial truth. The reality was more complicated Sarah had been operating an unofficial network, helping former military personnel and federal witnesses disappear when their lives were threatened. It was work she had started during her recovery from PTSD, a way to channel her skills towards something positive. Chief Morrison rubbed his temples. Sarah, are you telling me that you've been running some kind of witness protection operation out of our library? Not protection, Sarah corrected. Just temporary assistance. People who needed help disappearing until federal marshals could establish proper safe houses. How many people are we talking about? Castellanos demanded. Tommy was the third person I helped in the past 2 years, Sarah admitted. Each time, it was a matter of keeping someone alive for a few days or weeks while proper arrangements were made. The detective's pen moved rapidly across his notepad. And the other two? Where are they now? Safe, Sarah replied. In legitimate witness protection programs with new identities and federal oversight. But not Tommy. Sarah's expression darkened. Tommy's case was different. He had information about Iron Wolf's connections to a larger criminal network, something that went all the way up to federal legislators. There were concerns about leaks within the Marshal Service, so my contact asked me to help Tommy stay off the grid while they figured out who could be trusted. A knock on the office door interrupted the conversation. Agent Rebecca Chun, the FBI's lead investigator on Iron Wolf's activities, entered without waiting for permission. Ms. Martinez, Agent Chun said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous criminals. We need to talk. Agent Chun was a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of focused intensity that Sarah recognized from her own military service. She carried herself like someone who had spent years building cases against violent organizations and wouldn't be intimidated by anyone or anything. The men you injured are all talking, Chun continued, settling into a chair without being invited. Bobby Hutchins is trying to cut a deal, claiming he was just following orders from higher up in the organization. But what's interesting is what he's saying about you. Sarah remained silent, waiting for the agent to continue. According to Hutchins, the Iron Wolves received specific intelligence about your military background before they came to Cedar Falls. They knew they were dealing with a former SEAL, and they came prepared for resistance. The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a cold fog. If the Iron Wolves had known about Sarah's background in advance, it meant they had intelligence sources with access to classified military records. Someone sold you out, Chief Morrison said quietly. It appears so, Agent Chun agreed. Which means your friend Tommy Reeves was right to be suspicious about leaks in federal law enforcement. The question now is how deep this corruption goes and who else might be compromised. Sarah felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had hoped her days of dealing with complex conspiracies and multiple levels of deception were behind her, but circumstances were pulling her back into that world whether she wanted it or not. Where is Tommy now? Agent Chun asked directly. Safe, Sarah replied. But I won't reveal his location until I'm confident about the security of this operation. Ms. Martinez, the agent said, her voice hardening, you're not in a position to negotiate. You're a civilian who has interfered with a federal investigation. I can have you arrested for obstruction of justice. Sarah met the agent's gaze without flinching. Agent Chun, I've spent 8 years dealing with threats to national security. I know the difference between following orders and doing what's right. Until you can guarantee Tommy's safety, he stays where he is. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Agent Chun was clearly not accustomed to having her authority challenged, especially by civilians. But Chief Morrison could see something in Sarah's expression that suggested pushing her further would be a mistake. Maybe we should take a step back, Morrison suggested diplomatically. Agent Chun, what kind of timeline are we dealing with here? How long before the Iron Wolves regroup and come back? They're already regrouping, Chun replied grimly. We've intercepted communications indicating that at least 20 additional members are en route to Cedar Falls. They'll be here by tomorrow morning, and this time they won't be coming to ask questions. Sarah felt her blood run cold. 20 armed bikers descending on a town of less than 3,000 people would be a massacre. Cedar Falls had 2 police officers, a volunteer fire department, and citizens who thought locking their doors at night was an unnecessary precaution. "You need to evacuate the town," she said immediately. "That's not possible," Agent Chen replied. "We can't displace an entire community based on intercepted communications that might be deliberately misleading. Besides, running would just delay the confrontation." "Then what do you propose?" Morrison asked. Agent Chen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're going to use Ms. Martinez as bait. When the Iron Wolves arrive tomorrow, she's going to be waiting for them." Sarah realized that her quiet life in Cedar Falls was not just over. It had become the center of a war zone. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting just for her own survival, but for the safety of everyone she had come to care about in this small town that had become her home. The storm was gathering, and Sarah found herself at the eye of it, whether she wanted to be there or not. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls with an eerie stillness that seemed to hold its breath before the coming storm. Sarah stood at the window of her cabin, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Atlas sat beside her, his ears alert to sounds that hadn't yet reached human perception. Both of them knew that today would decide whether the peaceful life they had built together would survive or whether they would have to become warriors once again. The plan Agent Chun had outlined was deceptively simple. Sarah would return to the library and resume her normal routine, appearing vulnerable and isolated. When the Iron Wolves arrived, and intelligence suggested they would come in force around noon, she would draw them into a confrontation that would allow federal agents positioned around the town to move in and arrest the entire group. What Agent Chun hadn't mentioned, but what Sarah understood from years of military experience, was that plans involving 20 armed criminals rarely went according to script. Variables multiplied exponentially when violence was involved, and the safety of innocent civilians could never be guaranteed. Sarah had spent most of the night preparing for alternatives that Agent Chun either couldn't consider or wouldn't discuss. Hidden throughout the library were weapons and equipment she had retrieved from her safety deposit box in the next town over, items she had hoped never to use again, but couldn't bring herself to destroy completely. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Chief Morrison. "Federal agents in position. Library opens in 30 minutes. You sure about this?" Sarah typed back, "As sure as I can be." She wasn't sure at all, but certainty was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford. Sometimes you moved forward with incomplete information and trusted your training to carry you through whatever happened next. Atlas whined softly, sensing her tension. Sarah knelt and scratched behind his ears, looking into the intelligent brown eyes that had been her constant companion through the darkest periods of her recovery. "I know, boy," she said quietly. "I promised we were done with this kind of thing. But sometimes the fight comes to you whether you want it or not." The drive into town felt longer than usual, every familiar landmark taking on new significance as Sarah wondered if she would see them again. Mrs. Patterson waved from her garden as Sarah passed, the elderly woman having no idea that her quiet neighbor was about to become the center of a firefight. The library stood exactly as she had left it the evening before, after the FBI's crime scene team had finished their investigation. Agent Chen had insisted that everything be restored to normal appearance to avoid tipping off the approaching Iron Wolves members. To anyone driving by, it would look like just another ordinary morning at the Cedar Falls Public Library. Sarah unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old books and polished wood. Someone had done an excellent job cleaning up the destruction from yesterday's confrontation, but Sarah could still sense the lingering tension in the air. Violence left traces that were difficult to completely erase. She moved through her opening routine mechanically, turning on lights, starting the computer system, checking the book return slot for overnight deposits. Every action was performed with the hyper-awareness of someone who knew they were being watched by unseen allies, and that enemies would soon arrive. At exactly 9 a.m., she unlocked the front door and flipped the sign to open. Through the windows, she could see no obvious signs of the federal agents Chun had promised were positioned around the building, but Sarah knew they were there. The question was whether they would be close enough to help when the shooting started. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. A few regular patrons stopped by, Mrs. Henderson looking for a new mystery novel, young Billy Thompson needing help with the school report, and Sarah had to maintain the facade of normalcy while her entire nervous system hummed with anticipation. At 11:47 a.m., Atlas raised his head from where he had been lying behind the circulation desk. His ears pricked forward and his nostrils flared as he caught scents carried on the morning breeze. Sarah felt her own pulse quicken in response to the dog's alert. Through the library's front windows, she saw the first motorcycle appear at the end of Main Street. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the rumble of dozens of Harley-Davidson engines filled the air as the Iron Wolves full force rolled into Cedar Falls like an invading army. Sarah counted at least 25 bikes as they formed up in the street outside the library. These weren't the same men who had come yesterday. These were harder, more dangerous individuals with the kind of prison tattoos and facial scars that spoke of lives spent in violent confrontation. The engines cut off simultaneously, leaving a silence that seemed heavier than the noise had been. Sarah watched as the bikers dismounted and organized themselves with military precision. Someone among their leadership had combat experience, and that knowledge made her situation considerably more dangerous. The leader of this group was a massive man with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the multiple weapon bulges beneath his leather jacket and the way the other bikers deferred to his authority. This was no longer about finding Tommy Reeves. This had become about avenging yesterday's humiliation and sending a message about what happened to people who crossed the Iron Wolves. Sarah moved away from the windows and took up position behind the circulation desk, where she had hidden several items that might help even the odds. Atlas positioned himself beside her, every muscle tensed and ready for action. The front door exploded inward as 3 bikers kicked it open simultaneously, the heavy glass panel shattering across the hardwood floor. The massive leader strode through the destruction like a conquering general, his eyes immediately finding Sarah behind the desk. Well, he rumbled, his voice carrying the rough edge of a lifetime smoker. The famous Navy SEAL librarian. I'm Diesel Morrison, national president of the Iron Wolves. You put 3 of my men in the hospital yesterday. Sarah remained motionless behind the desk. They attacked me first. I defended myself. Diesel laughed, but the sound held no humor. Defended yourself? Lady, you destroyed them. Bobby's got a shattered arm and a concussion that's going to leave him stupid for the rest of his life. Tommy's still unconscious, and the doctors don't know if he'll ever wake up. I gave them multiple opportunities to leave peacefully, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Peaceful? Diesel's expression darkened. You know what's not peaceful? Having federal agents raid our clubhouses because some witness decided to turn traitor. You know what's not peaceful? Having our business operations shut down because you helped that rat stay hidden. As Diesel spoke, more bikers poured through the ruined doorway. Sarah counted at least 15 men inside the library now, with more visible through the windows. Each one was armed, and several had already drawn weapons in anticipation of violence. Where is Tommy Reeves? Diesel demanded. I told you men yesterday. I don't know, Sarah replied. Diesel pulled a massive revolver from inside his jacket and pointed it directly at Sarah's head. Wrong answer. See, we know you've been helping federal witnesses disappear. We know you've got some kind of underground network running out of this library. And we know that Tommy Reeves is still alive because of you. Sarah felt time slow down as her combat training kicked into full gear. She could see the tension in Diesel's trigger finger, could calculate the trajectory of his weapon, could assess the positions of all the other armed men in the room. Most importantly, she could see something that Diesel and his men couldn't. The subtle hand signals being exchanged by what appeared to be ordinary townspeople visible through the library's side windows. Agent Chen's federal team was moving into position, but they would need at least another 30 seconds to surround the building completely. Sarah needed to buy that time without getting herself killed. You're right, she said suddenly. I have been helping people disappear. Diesel's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Go on. There's a network of former military personnel who help federal witnesses when a marshal service can't guarantee their safety. Tommy Reeves was just one of dozens of people we've relocated over the past few years. It was a masterful blend of truth and fiction designed to make Diesel believe he was getting valuable intelligence while actually revealing nothing specific about Tommy's location. Who runs this network? Diesel pressed, keeping the gun trained on Sarah's forehead. Compartmentalized cells, Sarah replied, falling back on real counterintelligence protocols. No single person has complete information about the entire operation. Outside, she could see Agent Shin moving into position near the library's back entrance. Almost time. But you know where Tommy is right now, Diesel insisted. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Tommy Reeves is dead. The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Several of the bikers looked confused, while others raised their weapons higher. What did you say? Diesel's voice was dangerously quiet. He's dead, Sarah repeated. Heart attack 3 days ago. Stress from being hunted by your organization finally caught up with him. It was a complete lie, but Sarah delivered it with the conviction of someone reporting an established fact. The confusion and uncertainty it created among the Iron Wolves was exactly what she needed. Diesel's face went purple with rage. You're lying. Check the county morgue records, Sarah suggested calmly. John Doe, brought in Tuesday morning, no identification, cardiac arrest. For a moment, the tension in the room wavered as Diesel processed this information. If Tommy Reeves was dead, then their entire reason for being in Cedar Falls had evaporated. But the humiliation of yesterday's confrontation still demanded satisfaction. Even if he's dead, Diesel snarled, you still cost us 3 men and brought federal attention to our operations. That requires payback. Sarah could see Agent Shin's team preparing to breach the building from multiple directions. In another few seconds, the library would become a war zone. Atlas, she said quietly, take cover. The German Shepherd immediately bolted for the safety of the reference section as Sarah dove behind the circulation desk, just as Diesel pulled the trigger. The bullet splintered the wood where her head had been a split second earlier. The library erupted in chaos as federal agents smashed through windows and doorways simultaneously, shouting commands and firing at anyone who didn't immediately surrender. Sarah rolled to her left and came up with the shotgun she had hidden beneath the desk, but the battle was moving too fast for careful aim. Gunfire echoed through the building as the Iron Wolves found themselves caught in a crossfire they hadn't expected. Several bikers went down in the first exchange, while others dove for cover among the overturned furniture and scattered books. Sarah saw Diesel spinning toward Agent Chin's position and knew the federal agent was about to walk into a killing shot. Without thinking, she vaulted over the desk and tackled the massive biker from behind, sending both of them crashing into the biography section. Diesel was stronger than anyone Sarah had ever fought, but her military training gave her the edge in technique and speed. They rolled across the floor in a deadly embrace, each trying to gain control of his massive revolver. The gun went off during their struggle, the bullet punching through the library's ceiling and raining plaster down on the combatants below. Sarah managed to get her knee against Diesel's elbow and applied leverage that would have broken the joint of a smaller man. But Diesel absorbed the pain and backhanded Sarah with his free hand, the blow sending her sliding across the floor and into the children's reading area she had worked so hard to create. As Sarah struggled to regain her footing, Diesel rose like an avenging giant, his revolver tracking toward her position. She could see death in his eyes and knew that her time had run out. The shot that killed Diesel Morrison came from Atlas. The German Shepherd had circled through the chaos and positioned himself behind the biker leader. When Diesel raised his gun towards Sarah, Atlas launched himself with the full force of his 90-pound body, his teeth finding the major artery in Diesel's neck. The massive biker went down hard, his weapon firing harmlessly into the floor as his life poured out onto the hardwood that Sarah had swept clean every morning for 3 years. The gunfight ended as suddenly as it had begun. Of the 25 Iron Wolves who had entered Cedar Falls, 12 were dead, 8 were wounded, and 5 had surrendered when they realized the hopelessness of their situation. Agent Chun found Sarah sitting in the ruins of the children's reading corner. Atlas pressed against her side as she absently stroked his fur. Both woman and dog were spattered with blood, but neither appeared seriously injured. "It's over," Chun said softly. Sarah looked around at the destruction that had once been her sanctuary, the scattered books, the bullet holes in the walls, the bloodstains on the floor where she had once hosted story time for local children. "No," she replied quietly. "It's just beginning." She was right, of course. Within hours, news trucks would arrive from 3 states. The story of the Navy SEAL librarian would become national headlines. Publishers would offer book deals, movie producers would option her life story, and every major news program would want interviews. But more importantly, the underground network Sarah had described to Diesel would need to become real. There were too many federal witnesses who couldn't trust official protection, too many people running from dangerous enemies who needed the kind of help only former military personnel could provide. Sarah Martinez, the quiet librarian of Cedar Falls, Montana, was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would use her skills and experience to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. A week later, Sarah and Atlas stood on the porch of their cabin, watching moving trucks carry away the last of their belongings. The library remained closed indefinitely, too damaged for immediate repair and too famous for Sarah to ever return to her old role. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the end of the driveway, carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous apple pie. "I know you're leaving," the elderly woman said, "but I wanted you to know how proud we all are of what you did. You saved our town." Sarah accepted the pie with a grateful smile. "I just did what needed to be done." "Where will you go?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Sarah looked out at the mountains that had given her 3 years of peace and healing. "Somewhere I can help people who need it." As the moving truck disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah felt Atlas lean against her leg. The dog looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. "Ready for the next chapter, boy?" she asked. Atlas's tail wagged once, and Sarah knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The quiet life was over, but perhaps it was time to build something better, a life with purpose, where her skills could protect the innocent instead of haunting her dreams. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. 3 witnesses in Seattle need extraction. High-risk situation. Can you help? Sarah looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back a simple response. On our way. The war was far from over, but Sarah Martinez had finally found her place in it. And this time, she was fighting for the right side.